Up next on Inside the SCCA, catching up with a legend.
I was supposed to reply.
Welcome to Inside the SCCA. I'm Brian Bielanski, and I have got a special episode for you folks today. This is someone who I've wanted to have on the show for a very long time, and I was chatting with Kevin Coulter. He is one of the Super Tour race chair director, Grand Poobah people, and we were having an adult beverage one night after one of the Super Tours, and he mentioned that he knew a guy. And I'm like, you know that guy? And he's like, yeah, I know that guy. And I'm like, can you connect me with that guy? And he said, I'll try. And that guy is none other than Brian Redman. How are you doing, Mr. Redman?
Surprisingly good.
Surprisingly good. Well, you look fantastic. You look relaxed, and I understand you are in a hot and sticky part of Florida.
Yeah, we're in Vero Beach up on the East Coast, about an hour and a half north of Palm Beach, and yes, hot and sticky is the word.
So it's not often that we have two Brians on the show with both of their names spelled properly. So I am very pleased at that, and welcome to the show. For those of you who don't know Brian Redman, well, you know what? Let's start. Well, we start every show, Brian, the same way. And since you're a first-time guest, you're going to get the question. And that question is, how did you get mixed up in this crazy sport that we love?
Well, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, had passed away in about 1959, and he had a business making mop heads, you know, the woolly things that you clean the floors with.
Uh-huh.
And he employed two men doing it, and he was always a very keen car person, and I never figured out how he managed to afford some of the cars that he had. Like before the war, he had a BMW 328, and after the war, a Bristol 400, then a 401, then an Aston Martin DB24, and then a TR2 and an MGA when he passed away. And so, I made mop heads in Burnley, Lancashire, the industrial north of England, and I delivered them all over in the back of a Morris 1000 Woody traveller's car. And I put a Shorrock supercharger on it, harder brake linings, and a roll bar, and an anti-tramp bracket. And I drove delivering mops like a raving lunatic on the road. And I thought, I need to get off the road. That's how it started.
So it was an exercise in staying out of jail.
Yes, you could say that. Yes.
Very nice. Very nice. So when did you get what was your first experience or your first foray into actual organized motorsports?
Well, I started racing in that Morris Minor 1000. The first race was like Easter Monday of 1959 at a place called Ruffeth near York, which is as in the case in England of many racetracks, they were disused Air Force bases. And so from there, the following year, I went to a 848cc Mini, and then the following year to an XK120 Jaguar, and to a Morgan Plus 4. But of course, these cars were being used on the road all the time. And around September 1962, I thought I'd be getting married to Marion, my wife now of 62 years, because there were so many guys like me, you know, that are wanting to have a go, and so we got married. Well, then I was pretty well broke, and so I went motocross on motorbikes for 2 years. But in that time, I drove cars for other people in sprints and time trials. And one of them, one day in 1965, he said, I've got fastest time of day in this XK120. And he said, I know Charlie Bridges in Chester, who's just bought the ex-Graham Hill lightweight E-Type Jaguar. I'll get you a drive. So 2 days later, I'm at Oulton Park, and the owner of the car, who I'd never met, is there, Charlie Bridges. And he says, ever go then? And so off I go. Well, I know it's a great opportunity. I knew the track, but I'd never driven an E-Type of any description. But anyway, I managed to go like 3.5 seconds faster than the new owner, Charlie.
Oops.
I said, "What are you doing on Saturday?" This was Thursday. And he said, "Race the lightweight." And so we had a fantastic year. We were beaten once in 15 races by a 250LM Ferrari at Silverstone in September of 1965. So that's how it really got going.
That's crazy. That's crazy. Oulton Park, for those of us youngsters, we know Oulton Park here in the States because it's one of the entry-level racetracks on iRacing, on the sim racing. So that was my first ever introduction to what Oulton Park was. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome. So I first learned of you. I grew up in the Midwest, and my home track was Road America. And I heard of this legend of Brian Redmonds Cat, and we're going to talk about the cat in a while, but we'll figure out when we get to the right point in our conversation for the cat to be brought up. You let me know, okay?
Okay.
So when did you come over stateside for the first time to go racing?
Well, just briefly, in 1967, Charlie Bridges decided to cut back on his racing, but he had a younger brother, David, who had actually lost a driver, David Taylor, in an accident at the Nürburgring, and had been burnt. He'd actually been released from the local hospital, but he got an infection and passed away. And so David still wanted to carry on racing, and he rang me one day. He said, "Do you want to turn professional?" I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "It means I'll pay you 30 quid a week, about $50 a week, guaranteed for a year, with a car and a mechanic." And so that's kind of how I turned professional. But towards the end of that year, now, instead of just doing club racing, I'm doing international racing, with Jim Clark, Graham Hill, John Surtees, Bruce McLaren, all the boys, in Formula 2.
Okay.
I actually never drove a single-seater till I was 30 years old, which is getting on a bit. But I like the single-seater better than the sports cars. So although I had a lot of success in sports cars, I really enjoyed the single-seaters. And so in about September of that year, a guy that I knew rang and he said, "Would you like to drive my 250LM at Montlhéry, the Paris 1,000 kilometers, with Richard Atwood?" And so we actually did okay. We won the class. And it was a terrible wet race, pouring with rain all the time. And after the race, this tall, rather distinguished-looking gentleman came up to me and he said, "Mr. Redman, I'm David York, the team manager for John Wire Automotive Engineering. Would you care to drive with Jackie Hicks at the Kyalami 9-hour race next month in November?" And Jackie and I won the race. And so now I sign a contract, the best long-distance team in the world with the GT40. And at the same time, I suddenly became the flavor of the month, and the Cooper Car Company, John Cooper, rang me and he said, "Mr. Redman, would you care to do the South African Grand Prix at Kyalami, where we'd just been, in January?" And so I go there, and then the car was terrible. It had a Maserati V12 that was just pumping oil in every direction. And before the race, John said to me, "Brian, try and do 5 laps. We need the starting money." And so I did 5 laps and retired. Then in the meantime, Jackie Hicks and I won the Brands Hatch 6 hours in the GT40 and the Spa 1,000 Ks in the GT40. And I finished 3rd in the Spanish Grand Prix, my next Formula 1 race. And the week after that, I was 2nd to Jochen Rindt in a Formula 2 race. And the week after that, we go back to Belgium, to Spa for the Grand Prix. And on the 7th lap, the suspension broke. I had an enormous accident. I landed right in a corner worker's post. And as the Cooper rolled over the barrier, my arm got trapped and it was broken. I felt it break. And then 3 wheels came off. There was a total scene of terrible. One wheel hit a corner worker.
Oh, boy.
And he was badly injured. He had a ruptured spleen and a heart attack. So here we are. I go from being, the new Wonder Boy to, who's Redman? So when Professor Ferdinand Orban of the University of Liège Teaching Hospital got me on the table about 4 hours later. Because my arm had been crushed, both bones had come out, but they'd overlapped like that, and how he dragged them back like this, I don't know. But he said to me as he's getting ready to operate, he said, Monsieur Redman, it may not be possible to save the arm. I smiled and said, thank you, Professor. He says, why are you smiling? I said, because I'm here, which was true.
Yeah.
And on the Monday, the next day, John Cooper came to see me and he said, what happened, my boy? I said, something broke, John. And he said, well, you'll be all right. Well, on Thursday of that week, Motoring News, which was a weekly periodical, said Redman claimed the steering broke. And the editor got a call from John Cooper and he said, I want a complete retraction. It was driver error.
Ooh.
So the editor said, Mr. Cooper, I suggest you look at tomorrow's Autosport. And there was a photograph taken head on, just fractions of a second before I hit the barrier. And it showed the right front suspension on the ground.
Yeah.
So anyway, there we go.
Yeah. Interesting. So that was a very tenuous era for motorsports. I always comment. I do a radio show, and whenever I have to do an obituary piece on a racer, I always say that I'm always happy to do an obituary for an old racer.
Yes.
Because there's a lot of people from your era who weren't allowed to didn't get the chance to become old racers.
No, I mean, I lost 6 teammates in 3 years.
Wow.
And that's not counting the famous drivers who I knew and who had raced against, like Jimmy Clark. I mean, when Jimmy Clark was killed at Hockenheim in 1968, I was just about to get into the GT40 at a wet Brands Hatch. I'm feeling nervous, the rain's pouring down, I'm just about to get in. And a journalist came up to me and said, heard about Jimmy, mate.
What did you just have to block it out? Did you just have to have blind faith in the system that whatever happens at the end is going to be what's going to happen?
Yeah, pretty well. I mean, several times, especially at Spa-Francorchamps, which was so fast. I never sleep the night before the race, particularly in 1970, when we had the new 917s. And we were the fastest lap in the race was an average of 160. The race average was 149. We were doing 200 miles an hour, mile after mile, 8 miles, including a first gear hairpin, La Source, and a third gear left-hander Les Combes at the top of the hill, which is where I crashed in the Cooper. And so and also, of course, every time leaving the family and saying goodbye to a little boy, 3 or 4 years old, and a little girl, a year old, and my wife I knew, it could be the last time.
Right.
But, if you don't want to do it, there's 100 people waiting to take your place.
Sure.
And I think what happens, it's life, isn't it?
Was Eau Rouge the same corner back then that it is now? Because it is crazy scary now with all of the safety that we have today. I can only imagine what that was like back then.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit faster then. Of course, there were no runoff areas.
Right.
It was definitely a tricky area. It wasn't quite flat out because we didn't have the downforce that the cars have today. Nothing like, nowhere near. So, but still, I didn't think that Eau Rouge was the most difficult. To me, the most difficult was the kink in the Master Straight. The Master Straight was 4 miles.
Yeah.
In the middle, there was a farmyard, and it was blind. It went left and right. And in the 917s in 1970, we came into it at 214 miles an hour.
In 1970?
And went through it about 180. It wasn't flat.
Wow. That is just crazy. When you think of the cars you drove then and the cars that we have today, whether it be Formula One or whether it be the Le Mans, World Endurance Championship cars, What do you think about the difference in those cars?
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every single thing. The safety, the engines, the gearboxes. Today, you can't make a mistake. In the old days, we lost Le Mans in 1970. In the 917, we were leading by 4 laps. That's 32 miles.
Wow.
And my great co-driver, Joe Siffert, came past the pits, probably 1 or 2 in the morning. It was raining, miserable. And there were 3 slower cars ahead of him, all having their own race. And he pulls to the right to overtake them. And right in front of the Porsche pit, missed a gear.
Yep.
A very slow Synchromesh gearbox in the Porsches at that time. I mean, the Synchromesh gearbox was probably at a long track like Le Mans, which is 8.5 miles. It was probably costing us 2 seconds a lap compared to a racing gearbox where you didn't have to be so careful. But anyway, those Porsche 917s would go to 8.4 for 40 hours.
Wow.
And if they went once to 8.6, the valve gear broke. So it went to a lot more than 8.6.
Well, and that back then were there rev limiters back then to prevent you from doing something stupid?
No, the only ones that had rev limiters in those days were Matra.
Okay.
Matra had rev limiters.
So in addition to the driving of the car in a precision manner, hitting your turn-in points and hitting your apexes, you also had to operate the car in a precision manner, which a lot of that's been taken away today by driver aids, right?
Yes. It's I can't believe how different it is. And back in the late 60s, early 70s, the main focus of major manufacturers like Porsche and Ferrari was lightweight and straight line speed. I mean, I don't know if you ever looked at the chassis of a 917. Weighs about 80 pounds. I mean, one reasonably healthy man can lift it above his head like that.
Wow.
And the 908-3, which was built only the Targa Florio, 44 miles to 1 lap and 800 corners per lap. And the Nordschleife Nürburgring, which was 170 corners and 14 and a half. It was built only for that.
Right.
And it weighed 1,100 pounds.
So did the lightweight cars start to go away as an engineering need for safety? What was because today now you would even think of putting an 1,100-pound sports car at Le Mans.
Well, you wouldn't think of putting the driver's feet in front of the front wheels either.
That's right. Yeah.
So, yes, I mean, the safety thing was coming on in the early 70s. And even in 72, the new rules for long-distance racing specified a minimum weight.
Right.
And that was why the 908-3 was no longer competitive, because it was too light. And they only had that air-cooled 8-cylinder engine with just under 400 horsepower. And so, it was then competing against the Ferraris and the Cosworth Formula 1 engine cars, and it couldn't compete. Yeah.
And I would think as thin as those chassis were, you couldn't ballast them because they just flex.
Oh, no, there wasn't any ballasting. No.
Yeah.
Well, there was a lot of talk about the chassis 917 flexing, but it didn't.
Okay.
All the original troubles with it we know now, well, we knew by the end of 1969, were aerodynamic.
Sure.
It was funny, really, because at that time, in 69, of course, Porsche, for the first time ever, had a chance to win the manufacturer's championship because of the rules change.
Right.
So this is Ferdinand Piëch, Dr. Porsche's nephew, and believe me, I've never met a more single-minded, determined person in my life. And I've often said, half jokingly, that if Ferdinand Piëch had been Adolf Hitler, we'd all be speaking German today. He was unbelievable. He nearly bankrupted Porsche and threw everything at the racing program. So there they were with about 15 908s, long tail and short tail, 10 drivers, 6 Germans, 3 English, 1 Swiss. And unbelievable. And so in 69, when we knew about the new 917, and we knew it was being built in a big hurry, and it was being copied off the 908 Longtail, which wasn't a very good handling car anyway. And so one day I get a call from the Weissach, Porsche competition. Redman, you will come to Weissach and test the new 917. I thought, why do they want me? I'm in the north of England.
Right.
They've got 6 German heroes living near Stuttgart, ready to die for the fatherland. So I said, I have some business things. I'll call you back. Please call. I said, I will. So I called Joe Siffert in Freiburg in Switzerland. And I said, Joe, have you tested the new 917 yet? There's a long silence. He said, no, Brian. We let the others find out what breaks first. I couldn't go.
So who was more single-mindedly focused on the competition, Ferdinand Porsche or Enzo Ferrari? Because it sounds like they both almost bankrupt their. Well, from what you're saying, and I know the story of Enzo, they both pretty much bankrupt their companies to try to go racing.
Yes, well, I would think Enzo was probably the more determined on the racing side, although not in the era of Ferdinand Piëch, which started about 1968.
Right.
He became the competition manager for Porsche, and then he instigated the whole 917 thing, and how Porsche did what they were doing at that time, I just can't imagine, because car manufacturing was only part of the business at that time. It was like half of the business were doing work for other companies. And so it's an amazing, absolutely amazing.
Yeah, that era is so much of what we have today is different, but what we have today would never be what we have today without those cars that you pioneered on the racetrack.
Yeah, I guess.
It's pretty amazing. So you came to the States and won the Formula 5000 championship here. What were the years for that? You won it in 74, 75, and 76.
I should have won it in 73.
Okay.
I won 5 races, and Jody Scheckter, who won the championship, won 4. But I missed 2 races racing for Ferrari in Europe, and he got more points.
Gotcha.
So it all started, well, the first race in America was Daytona, 1968, with John Wyer and Jackie Hicks in 40. That I'd made a really stupid retirement, one of many stupid things I've done in my life, to South Africa, Johannesburg, at the end of 1970. And I realized I didn't understand the apartheid, the division between the white people and the black people.
Sure.
I got, after 4 months, I said to my wife, I said, these colored people are going to turn around one day, and it'll be bad. We're going back. And so I arrived back in England in March of 1971 without a drive. But a friend of mine, Sid Taylor, the Irish entrant, who I'd raced a Lola T70 Mark 3B Coupe for in 1969, he had a Formula 5000 car. So he said, let's run that. So off we go. Well, towards the end of the year, the car wasn't very good. It was old-fashioned. It was heavy. It was built by Trojan. It wasn't a true McLaren-built car.
Sure.
And so I was very friendly with Derek Bennett of Chevron Cars, and there are a lot of Chevrons racing today in historic racing and in SCCA.
Right.
He was a brilliant engineer, self-taught, good driver, very good driver. And I said to him in about October of 71, can you build a 5000 car? And he said, yeah. So I said, how long and how much? He said, 10 weeks and whatever it costs me. This is the only real racing car I ever bought. I paid Derek £3,000, about $5,000, for this new Chevron. Sid Taylor did all the running, engine, gearbox, everything else, mechanics. But the first day of testing at Oulton Park, it broke the lap record. And then it won the first 2 races.
Wow.
Sid shouts, $20,000 for first place at Watkins Glen. We're going.
Yes.
So we push it on an open trailer in Liverpool. We buy a $500 station wagon in New York. We take it to Watkins Glen. We're leading by 40 seconds from Graham McRae with 7 laps to go, and the battery went flat.
Oh.
So the last race of the year was at Riverside. And on the last lap of the last race, I'm aiming to try and pass the leader, Sam Posey, in his 30s. And so I'm not long back straight before turn 9. I'm coming up in his slipstream like this at about 170. And the back of his car came at me and I swerved to miss him. I hadn't intended trying to pass just then. So anyway, there's a protest put in. I've overtaken under the yellow. So the chief steward comes to me and in a strong Lancashire accent, he says, "Now then, Brian, lad, I'm Joe Smith from Accrington." Accrington was 6 miles from where I lived in Burnley. I'd never met him. He said, "As one Lancashire lad to another, did Sussy yellow flag or not?" I said, "No, I didn't." He said, "Right, lad, you're the winner." And just after that, I got fined $100. And this smallish gentleman came up to me and he said, "I'm Carl Haas, the Lowland fuel and gearbox importer for North America. I'm forming a partnership with a Jim Hall of Chaparral cars. For next year, would you like to drive?" That's how it happened.
That's amazing. That's amazing. What was the difference racing in the States versus racing in Europe?
There was not so much difference. I mean, in historic racing, there's some difference these days in that the English still, in these European races are still like there's $1 million at stake. But back in the Formula 5000 days, it was similar. I'd say there was a little bit more competition side in Europe, but in America, of course, especially in 1974, when USAC joined the SCCA in the promotion of Formula 5000, suddenly we've gone from being this rather club type of racing to major stuff, with Mario Andretti,
right,
Bielanski, Alan Sir, Gordon Johncock, Johnny Rutherford, and others. It really upped the series.
Sure. You've rattled off in the last half hour some of the most iconic names in motorsports over the years that you've raced against and raced with. The stories that you can tell, we probably could go for 5 hours, but we do have a limited time here. But can you share just some of the craziness that went on in that era?
Well, I mean, there was definitely in the late 60s, there was a bit of a feeling of, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die.
Right.
Because we had enormous parties afterwards, because in those days, nobody flew back after the race. You couldn't. The night of the race, you couldn't. And so there were some big parties. I mean, the first time I ever saw a food fight was in France, in Reims, and we'd all gone to dinner and all properly dressed, jacket and tie, nice restaurant and everything. Well, we'd just finished dinner and we're having our brandies, and Jimmy Clark picked up a butter knife and a piece of butter and he flicked it like that. And I watched this butter pat fly through the air and land right in the middle of the nose of an attractive young lady.
Oh!
This started the first food fight, that I ever saw.
And I'm sure...
And there were many more over the years. There was a good one in 1981 at Mid-Ohio. David Hobbs was driving the BMW. I had the Lola G600. And John Bright, my mechanic, I had gone to dinner after the race. And there was David and his 2 mechanics at a restaurant table. And as we were walking past, I saw that he had a very nice piece of sponge dessert in front of him. So I just picked it up and placed it on his face. So, a couple of months later at Road America at Siebkins, he got his own back.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting on the table. I've just finished the main course. My dessert is in front of me. The next minute, it's on my face.
Nice.
So I stood up and I said, "Lemon meringue pie." And that started a food fight. And Doug and the owners of Seekins were going into the kitchen and bringing bread rolls and buns and God knows what they were.
You would think the owners of the establishment would want it to stop, but they were bringing out the ammunition.
I can't go into some of the more lurid things that happen.
Sure you can. It's just you and me. No.
Well, 1971. Well, I described how I'd had this terrible year in the end of 70, in early 71. And what really saved my career in many ways was that Sid Taylor borrowed a BRM Can-Am car that was ordered originally by George Eaton, the Canadian millionaire.
Yeah.
We took it to Imola in Italy. It poured with rain. It was 500 kilometers, 300 miles. And I managed to lap the field. And in the field was a factory Ferrari, Clay Regazzoni. And after the race, Engineer Mauro Fagari came up to me and said, "Brian, what are you doing next year?" So 2 great years with Ferrari in the 312 PB.
Right. So you mentioned Road America. You mentioned Siebkens. I'll be there in a couple of weeks for the June sprints. And I will make a pilgrimage to Siebkens like we all do. My first time at Road America was my dad was driving, and we went there for the Cat Nationals. And I had no idea why it was called the Cat Nationals. So I'm being a precocious, young, budding, maybe a journalist someday. So I started asking questions, and they told me you have to find out about the legend of Brian Redmonds Cat. I have Brian Redman here, and I want to hear the story from the man himself. Tell me about Brian Redmonds Cat.
Yeah, it was started by a corner worker at Road America who, in the evening after the practice and racing and etc., the SCCA workers used to drink a toast to Brian Redmonds Cat, and that's how it started. And there is a sort of a crypt down there which is looking a bit distressed when I saw it last year. But when it was initiated, I went and borrowed a Tigers uniform from Milwaukee, and I christened, the grave.
So was there a cat?
No. Well, I mean, there probably are some spare cats. Yeah.
Sure. So it just started as a toast.
Yeah. So I was going to tell you about the more incidents, in racing, but I got off track about the 71 drive in the Ferrari 312 PB, my first drive.
Right.
At Kyalami again, the 9-hour race. And I managed to put it on pole position ahead of my more famous co-drivers, Clay Regazzoni, Mario Andretti, and Jackie Hicks. And Clay and I won the race. Mario and Jackie was second. Well, the event hotel, is the Kyalami Ranch, and the rooms there were straw huts. They were buildings with straw tops called rondables. Mm-hmm. I was actually staying 20 miles away with a motorcycle and car racer called Paddy Driver, who'd lent me his fearsome 500cc 3-cylinder 2-stroke Kawasaki. So anyway, it's about midnight. We've thrown all the dining room chairs in the pool and tried to get one of the rental cars in, but couldn't do it. And everybody's pretty well gone to bed. And Regazzoni said to me, Brian, we have some fun with Mario. I said, yeah. Anyway, so he lit a newspaper and he threw it in through Mario's door. Well, it might have been okay if it was Mario's room, but it wasn't.
Uh-oh. Whose was it?
He was a businessman, had no interest in racing.
Oh.
And the police came.
Uh-oh.
I had a wild ride back on this Kawasaki, and we had to smuggle Clay out of Johannesburg the following day.
Wow. That is crazy. What was that? What were those 3 seasons that you won Formula 5000 like? Were you going back and forth for those races, or were you basically based here?
Yes. I actually, they were fantastic. I mean, the the team, Jim Hall led from the front, and Francois, the brilliant engine builder and test driver. I could have gone to any race and not practiced. All I would have done was give it a bit more oversteer. He liked a bit more push than I did.
Right.
And Troy Rogers, the fabricator, Davy Evans, the British mechanic who was murdered in Indianapolis, and Tony Connor, another Brit who did the gearbox. I mean, this was a great, great team. And so, living in England, at that time, I had a wonderful life. I had an 18th century house with a 2-acre walled garden. In the garage, I had a Porsche 917, and I had a 100-acre farm 10 miles away. And when they changed the rules, when the SCCA changed the rules to Can-Am at the end of 76 for the 77 season, they did it because it was a marketing exercise, because the crowds hadn't been as good for Formula 5000 as they'd been for Can-Am. And so now it was the new single-seater Can-Am, because, of course, nobody had the original type cars.
Right.
And so put bodywork on your single-seaters, and we're calling it Can-Am. So I arrive in Saint-Jovite, Canada, for the first race of the new season. I've never seen the car before, but I know it's going to be okay, prepared by Chaparral and tested by Francois. Out I go, 15 minutes, I come in. Jim Hall said, "How is it?" I said, "It's good." And at that point, I was 3 seconds faster than anybody. And he said, "What do you want?" I said, "Drop the front wing 1/4 of an inch." And on the next lap out at 170, it took off at the top of the hill, and it landed upside down. And it got C1, smashed this shoulder, split the breastbone, broke my ribs, the roll bar broke. I went down on the road. My helmet was worn away each side. The good thing was that as it rolled off the road at the end of its upside-down travels, it landed on its wheels. And the track doctor was a heart specialist. He got my heart going, which had stopped. And then the ambulance blew a tyre on the way to hospital. And when my wife arrived from England the next morning, the headline in the Montreal paper, in Redman, Redman is dead. And it showed the open doors and me lying in the back and the two guys, working on the wheel. And so because of that accident, I had to sell everything in England. I had no income. I wasn't earning anything. And I went to Highland Park, Chicago, to work for Carl Haas in 1980, and read very, very early on, I read the new rules that IMSA were trying to break Porsche domination. And they introduced a new GTP. And I said to Carl, Lola can build a Lola to these new IMSA rules that can win the championship. And I won't bore you with all the terrible stuff, the painful stuff that we had doing it, but we did that. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about Carl Haas. He's an SCCA Hall of Famer, a legend of North American motorsports, in many cases a visionary. What was it like working for Carl Haas?
Well, Carl Haas was one of the most hard-working people I've ever met. He was on the phone at 7 a.m. He worked non-stop, and he was a visionary, in many ways. I never had a contract with Carl. It was all a handshake. And I know there's several people that can make comments about that. Carl was brilliant. And of course, not just Carl, but Bernie, his wife, were also brilliant. She was, in many ways, the power behind the throne.
Wow.
And she's still running the business today.
Right. Any good now, when did Paul Newman and Carl Haas come together? Was that while you were with Carl?
No, that was after.
Okay.
After my time. Yeah.
Yeah. So you drove that Lola at Daytona, right?
The T600?
When the early generation GTP cars. Did you got to drive that, right?
Yes, I did. Yes.
How was that?
Well, it was okay. It was good, but this wasn't the 24 hours. It was like a fall race.
Yeah, that was the around July 4th area, somewhere in the fall, right?
It's maybe even later than that.
Okay.
It was later, but anyway, I was leading, but not by very far, from John Paul Jr. In his turbocharged 935.
Okay.
And on the last lap, I must say I was disappointed, in myself, because on that last corner, turn 4 of the last lap, you couldn't see anything. Not George Dawson. A Datsun 240Z had blown up, and you couldn't see nothing at all, completely covered in fog and smoke.
Wow.
And I just eased off a fraction, and it was enough for John Paul to pass me to win by half a car length.
Oh.
But, I'd already won the championship anyway. Not that that's an excuse. And also he was like 20 years younger.
Right. You did the 24 at Daytona, right? You won it at one point.
I won it 3 times. Yeah.
Okay. So, and that was before lights, right?
Yes.
So today, if you go to Daytona and do the 24, it's like daylight for almost the whole track. There's a tiny part. There's a tiny part in the infield that's a little dark, but not much, and the speedway's all lit up like a Christmas tree. What was it like doing Daytona without lights?
Well, horrible, but not as bad as Le Mans or as bad as Sebring.
Right.
Sebring was much worse. Yeah. In 75, with the BMW CSL, I was paired with Ronnie Peterson, a famous Formula One star, for Daytona. I never got in the car. It broke down before. So we go to Daytona. Ronnie couldn't drive. And they brought in an Australian saloon car champion. I don't remember his name. But anyway, Sam Posey and the young German Hans Stuck were in the other car. And Jochen Neerpasch, the team manager, said, Hans, he said, I wish you to go out and break the Porsches. And he says, you will take care and win the race. And that's what happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Sam Posey actually broke the leading Porsche, Peter Gregg. And but I did most of the driving, but Sam and Hans also did one session. So we had 4 drivers winning. But towards the end of the race, well, probably 15 minutes to go, the alternator was going out, so the lights were going. So I switched them off all the way around the track. I used other people's lights.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But going past the pits, I had to turn them on because otherwise we'd black flagged. And so with 15 minutes to go, I switched the lights on going past the pits. This is the only chance to look at the gauges.
Right.
The rear axle oil temperature gauge was off the clock. And I nearly started crying. I slowed right down and I crawled around like this, watching the gap coming down to the second place Porsche. And fortunately, it held together, and that was a really great win for BMW.
Right. So Daytona in January is like 12 hours of darkness because it's January.
Yeah.
Le Mans, because it's in June, is maybe 7 or 8 hours of actual darkness once you get past dusk and dawn. Which is harder without lights? It's got to be Le Mans, just because it's so dark at Le Mans, right?
Yes. Also, of course, in the rain at night.
Sure.
At Le Mans is really terrible. It's horrible.
Yeah. What's your
1979, I get a call from Porsche. Hey, Redman, you would like to do Le Mans with Jackie Hicks in the 936? Yeah, great. Off we go. Well, my first lap in the race, I come through the Porsche chicane before the pits. The pit entrance at that time was just past the chicane.
Right.
And it didn't feel quite right. And I hadn't done a lot of racing in the last year or two. And I thought, I didn't have time to think. I just carried on. So I turn into the Dunlop curve at 180 miles an hour and spin, because what I felt was the left rear tyre going down. So I spin all the way around the Dunlop curve, and then suddenly I hear the body coming off, everything banging and crashing. And then I see the barrier coming up, and I swerve and miss it. I stop at the start of the Melton Straight, where there was room to get off the track, and I cut the tyre off the rim. You had a hacksaw in the toolkit. So I drive it slowly round on the rim. I think we're definitely out. This is it. Half an hour later, it's going again. Well, 2 a.m, I'm up above the pits. It's pouring with rain, thunder, lightning. My oldest friend in the world, Ian Green, is standing with me, and the little monitor on the wall shows X is stopped on the Mulsanne. So anyway, 20 minutes later, X is going again. Well, we carried a spare fuel pump drive belt. It had broken.
In the car.
The spare, and he's going again. 5 minutes later, X is stopped again at the Mulsanne corner. So I know now this is it. We're out.
Yeah.
Half an hour later, X is going again. It comes in the pits. Norbert Singer, the team manager, looks up, waves to me. I shake hands with my friend Ian and say, goodbye, Ian, I think this is it, So I'm driving as hard as I can in pouring rain, 200 miles an hour in the dark. 40 minutes, I get a signal, pit. I go in the pits. Singer leans over, he says, Herr Redman, you can get out of the car. We were disqualified 1.5 hours ago.
What was the DQ for?
Because a mechanic had taken a sandwich to Jackie at the Mulsanne corner. And what was in it? A fuel pump drive belt.
Let me guess, a fuel pump drive belt. Wow. How did you get caught?
I don't know.
That's funny.
The marshals must have been pretty suspicious.
Yeah, absolutely.
They saw him changing the belt.
A second time.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty amazing. Pretty amazing. What's your favorite track of all time?
Well, after the race, Spa-Francorchamps, the old Spa, I won there 5 times. And although I'd had the accident there in 68, but after the race, you feel, boy, that was the greatest race. The Nürburgring, very good. In America, Mid-Ohio was a very lucky track for me. Road America, beautiful. Just such a great place. I'll be going there in July for the historic race, probably for the last time now.
Yeah. What are you doing these days?
Well, I keep reasonably busy. In a couple of weeks, I'm going up to Joliet to a car club called Autobahn.
Yep, we're familiar with it.
I'm driving a Porsche, raising money for the Heart Association. Nice. So people are going to pay to ride with me for, 5 laps or whatever. And we just came back last week from the Jacksonville Museum, the Brumos Museum. 2 weeks before that, I was in Monaco leading a tour at the historic races.
Yep.
And in July, I'll be at Road America, and so it's busy enough.
So how old are you now, if I may ask? I don't ask that question of a lady, so I can ask you though. How old are you these days?
87.
87. When people come up to you and ask questions and talk to you like me, how does that make you feel?
Well, it's very good, really. My wife complains about it, of course. I thought you'd be retired by now. Meaning doing nothing. No, it's okay. It's nice.
It strikes me that doing nothing probably isn't in your personality.
No, I actually hate doing nothing. I do.
Yeah. What would you say in all the things you've done? What's your crowning achievement?
Well, the proudest achievement is staying married to the same woman.
I love that.
And in terms of the racing, of course, those 3 Formula 5000 championships were the best, really. Because although I've won a lot of sports car races with great co-drivers, but they generally got most of the acclaim for it, with Joe Siffert for 2 years and Jackie Hicks for 2 years with the Ford GT40, and then with the Ferrari in 1972 and 3. And so, that's a team kind of effort. And of course, even the single seat of the Formula 5000 or any form of racing is very much a team effort. That Chaparral team was just the best.
How old were you in your last professional race?
Last professional race was 1989 for Aston Martin. And I had a good time, really. The car was a considerable disappointment. Peter Levanus and a partner had put the money up for it. They'd sold Aston Martin to Ford. And it was a first-class effort. But the idea that the designer had, and which he'd sold the idea to Peter Levanus, just didn't work. And so the car was really disappointing. The engineers and everybody, the team, everything was first class, but the car was just not fast enough. It's funny, at Le Mans, well, a couple of funny things. The Nürburgring were on what was the new circuit, which is like a modern circuit, nothing part of the old 14-mile circuit. And I hadn't had much practice, and so for some reason. But anyway, when I go out, I tag on to a Porsche 962 driven by a German who I knew the track. So I'm very close to him. There's a very fast chicane at like 130 miles an hour, maybe more. And I didn't expect him to brake. And so now I have to try this. And the next minute I'm going backwards at 130 instead of forwards. And so I go over the curb, and the barrier's right there. The curb, is a verge. Anyway, I managed to steer it away a bit and then swung the wheel round, and it spun round. And so now I'm going forward at, 70 or 80 miles an hour instead of 130. But Richard Williams comes on the radio. Well done, Brian. And he says, bet you can't do it again. So in practice, there'd been a black flag on the first lap, the warm-up lap. Somebody crashed. So we come in the pits, and Richard said, switch it off, Brian. So I switched it off. 10 minutes later, fire it up. So I fired it up. Richard? Yes, Brian? I said, there's a vibration in the engine that wasn't here 10 minutes ago. Give it a couple of laps. On the lap out, at 6,000 RPM, was the biggest bang I've ever heard. Well, the vibration was the crankshaft had broken.
Oh.
And so it went boom, and the whole engine was in 1,000 bits. Unbelievable. And then at Le Mans, the team owner, Peter Levanus, said, Brian, would you like to do the last session? Well, we were like 11th, it's hopeless. In the Mercedes and Porsches and Jaguars, we could stay with them all through the Porsche curves, a long way for a couple of miles onto the Mulsanne. But as soon as we got on the Mulsanne, we were doing 215 and they were doing 245. And so there's no chance of getting any higher or lower. I didn't really care. But anyway, out I go. And there's a corner called Arnage. And it was very easy to slide at about 100 miles an hour in second gear. Ooh. Well, for a few laps, I slid it, and then I didn't. I was bored. And after I'd stopped sliding it, there's a group of Brit enthusiasts on the right-hand side, and they hold up a big sign, give us some Oppo. So, then the next lap, now fastest lap. And the third and final time, rumpets and tea with the Queen.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Before I get to my final couple questions, I just need to thank the folks who helped me get this podcast on the air. Solo Performance Specialties. If you're going to go to an autocross, one of our national tour autocrosses, you could almost always find Dave there. He's also always at Solo Nationals. Really appreciate his support of the podcast. Also, the good people at Racekeeper. They are the official in-car camera of Inside the SCCA. If you check out their stuff, really great product, and they've got a new product coming that I can't tell you about just yet, but you are going to love that when I can. That's going to be fun, and we'll tell you about that hopefully in the next couple of weeks. And then, of course, Ray Esports. They are the official sim racing league of Inside the SCCA. They do a great job. I get on there whenever I'm not doing a podcast with Brian Redman on a Saturday. I'm on the sim with them, or if I'm not at the racetrack. So check out Ray Esports. All of their information is down in the show notes. You can click on the links. There's a couple of podcasts on there. Check all those good people out. Couldn't do the podcast without their help. All right, Brian, as we come to a close here, and again, I think we probably could talk for another couple of hours. What do you make of today's Formula One?
Well, I mean, the technology is amazing. I don't really find it so interesting. What I do is I record it, but in addition, on YouTube, I watch the 20 minute synopsis of the whole event, which I do that. But my wife likes to listen and look at the people talking, that sort of thing. But I don't. And then really, I know it's amazing, and the whole thing is almost unbelievable, and the money that's spent is also, and the money that people spend to go and watch it. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
But I don't really. I mean, there's some great battles in midfield, and one or two of the races recently have been very good. But I'd much rather see the cars sliding. In
Right.
the old days, with narrow tires and no downforce was actually a lot more fun to watch. Although much slower, of course.
Did you ever think you'd see the day where there'd be 3 Formula One races in the United States?
I did not. No, amazing, isn't it?
It's pretty remarkable how, and I think a lot of it, we talk about the Netflix show. I think that was a real big promoter of that to allow that to happen. But a very interesting situation with this whole saga of Andretti wanting to join Formula One. Politics, I'm sure, have never not been part of any motorsports. And I'm sure that was the case back in your early days as well, probably maybe even more so. Is it purely money, or is there any chance that the back markers especially are worried that Andretti could come in and make them look really silly really quickly?
Well, I don't really know. It's so complicated. Of course, the money that they're going to be asking for the Andretti team to come in is now gone up enormously.
Right.
Instead of 200 million, it's going to be 500 or 600 million. But as mentioned earlier, in Formula One, the money doesn't seem to be of any consequence, whatever it is, which is why they put the limitations, on
Right.
testing what we're allowed to do. It is, the whole thing's unbelievable. And quite, for me, of course, I'm being older, I hate all the politics and all the backward and forwards and the bitterness, of course, that comes in individually. I've tried to go through life not disliking too many people or
Right.
only one or two drivers that I didn't get on with. But is it worth it? I guess they think it is worth it. I don't
know. It's always struck me as interesting how all of those stories and those things come. I often think, though, football in Europe
Yes.
kind of gets it right, and I'm not a soccer guy, but they have a thing called relegation.
Yeah.
Where the worst team gets dumped out of whatever league, and then the best team in the lower league gets brought up. And I would think that would be a great system in Formula One or in any racing series, where the 10th place team in F1 gets dumped down to F2, and the first place team in F2 gets brought up to F1, and
Yes.
that would be an interesting thing, wouldn't it?
It'd be an interesting way to do it, but of course, again, the money comes into it so much.
Yeah.
So the top team in Formula 2, I don't know what they're spending, probably, a couple of million a year. I know that Formula 3 is about just close to $2 million a year to run a car in Formula 3. So I guess Formula 2 will be more than that, but still nothing like,
Sure.
Formula 1. That's like...
Yeah. Interesting.
Crazy. Yeah.
Definitely. All right, last 2 questions. Who was your favorite driver to race against? Either because it was fun or because he was a challenge to race against. Who is that driver?
Well, I would guess probably Mario. We raced against each other for 2 years. We never touched wheels, unlike with Mr. Scheckter. Where in about 8 races we hit each other twice. Came off best once, and I came off best the other time. But Mario, we had a good relationship. It was funny at Mosport, 1975. The race was delayed by an hour and a half as they swept broken beer bottles off the track.
Oh boy!
Eventually get going. We do a tour lap on the back of open Cadillac convertibles. And Mario and I are on the same one, which was the last one. We come around turn 3, and there, on the left-hand side of the road, is a naked man and woman.
Ah.
So Mario shouts to our driver, go back. So we go back, and Mario shouts at the guy, hey! Nothing. Hey! And the guy opens one eye, Mario shouts, "What time's the race start?" This guy goes, "What race?" We had a great race. I'd seen that Mario had dropped his wing for more speed up the straight. And I said to Jim Hall just before the race, I said, "Mario's dropped his wing." He said, "You want to do the same?" I said, "No, I'll leave it." Well, the result of that was that every lap, Mario pulled 5 or 6 car lengths on the straight. I was back with him again by the start and finish, which is like 3 corners. I couldn't get past. I finished like half a second behind. But for a race, I regard that as one of my best ever races where you absolutely could not have tried, any harder, even though finishing second. And so we had a good time. When my book was written, the publisher and Jim Mullen, who wanted to do the book, said, "Well, Mario will write the foreword." I said, "Mario's not going to write a foreword for my book." So we wrote to him and they said, "Send a draft." And they sent the draft and the reply came back, "Okay, do it."
Oh, that's great. That was great. All right, last question. We've talked about your favorite driver to race with. Who was the favorite driver from a shenanigans standpoint? Off the track, the fun, because you've talked about it a little bit with the food fights.
Yes.
Who is your favorite shenanigans instigator?
Probably Clay Regazzoni.
Okay.
It was Enzo Ferrari. I don't remember the exact words, but Enzo Ferrari said about Clay does not know whether he wished to be a racing driver or a playboy.
There was a lot of that back in the era, wasn't there?
Well, in 1972, at the Nürburgring, 1,000 kilometers, I'm driving with Arturo Mazzario, a very volatile, very small. He's like maybe 5'4", thin as a rake. Well, Clay and I had agreed to go to dinner with Mazzario. And so we go to his room at the old Sport Hotel and bang on the door. No, nothing, bang, bang, bang. Then ciao, which means hello, come in. So we open the door. And there is Arturo between 2 large, very well-developed German followers, camp followers, He's in between them. So we look at this ensemble, and Regazzoni says, "Girl, what you do with Arturo? He's so little." One of them says, "Yes," he says, "little, but good." So there are many more things along those lines, which I can't repeat. Sorry.
Sure. Brian, thank you so much. This has been an absolute blast. You've checked a bucket list interview for me. I'm so happy that we were able to connect, and a big thank you to Kevin Coulter for connecting the two of us together. I really appreciate that, and thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thank you, Brian. It's not to have to remember or write down the interviewer's name.
Yeah, we made it easy for you.
Remember, Brian.
All right, that's going to do it for another episode of Inside the SCCA. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to the channel so you know when the next one comes on. We do a new episode every week. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to the RacingWire Podcast Network or the Racing Network on YouTube so you can get all that information. We'd like you to leave a comment on our social medias, especially if it's a good one. If it's a bad one, leave it on someone else's social medias. Our Twitter is @RacingWireNet. There's a new Inside SCCA every week. I'm Brian Bielanski. Have yourself a fantastic weekend. Stay safe and go play with cars.
I'm Dorsey Schrader, and when I'm on my way to a race, I'll listen to the SCCA podcast, Inside the Short Bus.
Inside the SCCA is a presentation of the RacingWire Podcast Network and Rural 15 Productions. This podcast is not affiliated with, endorsed, or sponsored by the Sports Car Club of America. The views expressed within are those of the host and our guests and not that of the SCCA.